up on Dialogue Weekend. Afghan leaders meet U.S. President Joe Biden amid the ongoing U.S. troop withdrawal and intensified activities by Taliban militants. How will this impact the current security situation in Afghanistan? China releases a white paper elaborating on its political party system. How does the cooperation and consultation system work in modern Chinese government? And this week's Newsmaker. Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. Amid surrounding surging violence in Afghanistan, U.S. President Joe Biden met with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and the chairman of Afghanistan's High Council for National Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah, at the White House on Friday. As the Taliban gain territory and the U.S. pulls its remaining forces out of Afghanistan, hopes of a potential peace deal are giving way to fears of a rapid Taliban capture of the capital city, Kabul. Will the meeting between Biden and the Afghan leaders yield anything to rescue the situation? And what kind of Afghanistan will be U.S. troops leave behind? To find out more, I'm joined by Laluma Nasseri, co-founder and vice president of Afghanistan Justice, Rick Denham, former White House correspondent for Business Week, and Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. So welcome to the show. As the meeting took place, obviously in Washington, so I will start with the gentleman in Washington right now. Rick, what's your takeaway of the summit meeting between President Biden and his counterpart, Ghani?
Well, I think that it was both a success and a failure for the Afghan government. A success in that Biden offered them legitimacy, and it showed some sort of a statement of unity, that you had the different factions of the Afghan ruling parties there in Washington. It was a failure in that Joe Biden did not really offer anything new, anything other than he had promised before with help with intelligence, particularly weaponry, and he was pretty clear the United States is going to leave, that the date that he set is not negotiable. So the Afghan government got a short-term PR boost, but long-term they realized they're on their own. They have to figure out a way to unify the country and to militarily and security-wise take control.
Mm-hmm. So, John, there's not much substantial out of the meeting?
Yeah, well, other than mostly rhetorical, in my view. I mean, the support is really rhetorical, and other than $3 billion of support in the future, I think the situation is very worrisome. I don't think that the situation on the ground is better than 20 years ago when the United States started the war. After 20 years, after 2,000 American lives lost in what's called the graveyard for the empires, I guess, over $1 trillion spent on this war. And I think all these lives, all this money is spent in vain. Taliban is still cooperating, in my view, with Al-Qaeda. So I think even from a terrorism risk factor, I don't think the United States is any better than it was 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Very grave warning of the future. So we have a guest, Laluma, you are actually in Afghanistan, in Kabul, the capital city over there. Why don't you start with, telling us, sharing with us, what's the situation like in the city right now?
Well, in Kabul city, the situation is kind of normal, of course, with a lot of tensions around the recent escalation of violence in different parts of the country, particularly in north, where Taliban are actually attacking districts, and most of the cases they take control of those districts. But recently, the Afghan government has counterattacked, and they captured the losing districts again. But of course, it's not only the security tension here in Kabul that's taking over, but also the future of Afghanistan, the peace process that has gone kind of on pause and fair restarting. many different things here in Kabul.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder, what was your expectation when President of Afghanistan and Mr. Abdullah, went to Washington to meet President Biden over there? And are you disappointed, or are you, not surprised with the results of the meeting?
Of course, not surprised. As one of the participants in this dialogue program also mentioned, this was repeated commitments since many years. This is ongoing. My expectation from the meeting, and also not only mine, but most the people I knew here, was that maybe a major and important decision will be made in regards to the peace process in Afghanistan, which, with the withdrawal and also the current escalation in violence in Afghanistan, but nothing like that has happened. But this meeting has actually happened in a really critical juncture of time for Afghanistan, especially with the escalation in tensions and violence in the country. But of course, the expectations were more, but ended with renewed commitments, which again I would say kind of a positive result. But the most important thing that the people of Afghanistan were looking forward to was the major role that the U.S. has to play in the Afghan peace process, which not much has happened.
Mm-hmm. John, you mentioned about this, the situation is not really better than, say, 20 years ago. But what's the expectation, after the withdrawal of U.S. troops, whether on July 4th or even after, around that time? What kind of Afghanistan will be there? Some say in a couple of years, Taliban may overtake the entire country. Some say probably a few months. So what is the understanding there?
Well, I'm not an expert on the situation on the ground, but I can quote one intelligence report coming from the U.S. intelligence community warning that the current administration in Kabul will be run over by the Taliban within less than half a year. I mean, that's a very serious warning in my view. I mean, it reminds me of the scenario, the situation in 1975 in Vietnam when the United States withdrew, very shortly. Saigon was run over. Certainly, from Washington's perspective, we like, it doesn't want to see that happening. But I think they're not admitting this publicly. But I think behind those, I believe there's a consensus that something similar to what happened in Vietnam in 1975 were likely to happen. I mean, I think the situation really is Taliban incentivized to negotiate. From the recent actions, it is very clear that it doesn't have any intention to negotiate. It keeps attacking. So when you're in a position of strength, when you're in a better position, why would you stop and talk, right? I mean, you would still keep attacking. So I think with the U.S. troops withdrawal, there will be even more violence. There will be even more fighting going on. And how long the current administration can sustain, it's very much up in the air.
Mm-hmm. Well, Laluma, before I let you go, what is people's expectation, people's assessment, let's say, about this peace deal between Washington and Taliban? The condition is like U.S. will withdraw the troops, but the Taliban will cut ties with other extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, and also the negotiation between Taliban and the government forces. How is it going?
At this moment, of course, as you also are aware, the peace negotiation process in Doha has gone to a pause. Almost no interactions between both groups, unless in few recent days there were at least one or two meetings, but nothing very major. As the U.S. government and the Taliban agreement states, the U.S. government and their forces leave, and the Taliban cut ties with Al-Qaeda, which they didn't. In fact, reports indicate that these ties are even deeper now. And also the actions inside the country and the attacks made by Taliban increase instead of decrease. Taliban claim they believe in negotiation. They don't. Taliban claim they have changed. They have not. And Taliban actually are believing in force and believing in putting the country in chaos, and that's why they increase their attacks in different parts of the country, and many civilians lost lives and their homes, the places they live, they have to leave because of this escalation in violence. So in general, I believe, and also people of Afghanistan believe, that the Doha negotiations at this moment are not productive. But that's why we were expecting the meeting, results of the meeting, the recent meeting between the U.S. government and Afghan government, that U.S. should play a major role and basically should work on restarting the negotiations so that we reach a meaningful settlement, a meaningful agreement before the U.S. government leaves. Because leaving Afghanistan for the U.S. government as part of the U.S. Taliban negotiation is part of the agreement for the people of Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan. We have never been part of this agreement. So therefore, it will not have positive consequences for Afghanistan. The U.S. government should relook at their plan for withdrawal, and this withdrawal, if not meaningful, will have consequences for Afghanistan and region, and also the.
Yes, Rick. You know, obviously, given what I have talked about, and also I think there's a UN report basically says that the relationship between Taliban and Al Qaeda actually has been deepened. And so, what's the response, the public response, from U.S. public to the government decision to withdraw? Whatever happened, everybody understands probably nothing positive. But anyway, we will go ahead with the withdrawal plan.
It's a difficult situation. I think public support in the United States is for withdrawal because this is seen as a huge waste of money, a loss of lives, both American and particularly Afghan lives, and that the United States cannot play a constructive role. Looking at this, as John said, as another example of the graveyard of empires, and the United States following in the footsteps of the Soviet Union and Great Britain in trying to change and mold the future of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. Well, now we turn to China's political party system. The country's State Council Information Office on Friday issued a white paper titled China's Political Party System, Cooperation and Consultation, elaborating on the distinctive characteristics and strengths of China's political party system. To take a closer look at its content, again, we'll talk to Professor John Gong and Rick Dana. Well, John, what is the highlights of this white paper? It's a long one, obviously. I mean, the system itself is complicated. Share with us, what are the major points there?
Well, it talks about the history of China's Communist Party, how they came to be being, and also the legitimacy, not just coming from the current China right now, but also coming from a historic China, many years ago. So I think a lot of it is not news to we people actually who are, like you and me, were brought up in China and are very familiar with the system. But I think it does play a role in terms of providing some education to people outside the country who are not so familiar with our political system. I think one thing is important is that every time in the West the word communism or Communist Party is mentioned, denotes something not so good. Ronald Reagan has this very famous saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
When he talks about communism. But I think what's happening in China today is quite different. Communism in China, or the Communist Party in China, is not in the sense of what Marx and Engels were talking about. I mean, were describing. There's some time away from the kind of a scenario they're talking about. So I think it does this report is important in terms of providing a real context, putting things into perspective of what the Communist Party of China is doing right now, what is its role in Chinese society, and the public's general reception and acceptance of the party.
Yes, of course, the key message obviously is the system of a multi-party cooperation, political constitution, and the leadership of the CPC. Rick, you lived in China. Some people would say the Communist Party of China is more Chinese than Marxist, and some say the Chinese the system, there's a strong dose of pragmatism. It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. How do you explain it to the international society? What the Chinese system is like?
The Chinese government believes in leadership by the Communist Party, but consultation. Consultation is different than the Western concept of democracy, where you have multiple parties arguing and then voting and seeing if anyone can get a majority of a coalition. This is the leadership is central, and the idea, I think, is to tell other countries not necessarily to embrace communism with Chinese characteristics or whatever you would call it, but that a strong party can lead, but it needs to at least have the patina of multi-party or diversity, representing the diversity of a nation. And I think it's an alternative to Western-style democracy.
Yeah, well, this is you use the word like a Chinese characteristics. That's very important. To understanding this situation here. If you look at the performance, of the Chinese political system led by the Communist Party of China over the past, say, 20 or 40 years, it's unprecedented achievement. Poverty alleviation, infrastructure building, space exploration, increasing living standard. Some would also compare probably the Chinese, system here. It's really about the governance, John. It doesn't matter whether it's democracy or centralized system. It's really about the results. If you look at the governance, if you look at the performance of the Chinese Communist Party, probably few political parties can beat it.
Oh, I totally agree with you. The records speak for themselves. I think the CPC's legitimacy in terms of governance right now really comes from the last 40 years of economic achievement. You talk to everyone on the streets, everyone probably will say that, most likely going to say that China has done a great job, the party has done a great job. Now, we have to also be candid that the CPC has made numerous mistakes in the past, ever since its inception, before 1949 and after 1949. It also made mistakes. But every time the party made a mistake, it compensated by bouncing back stronger and better. I think that's something to be admirable about this political entity. Somehow the system, the political system in China has this vigor and also has this corrective mechanism, self-correction mechanism to bounce back, to admit its mistakes, to correct its mistakes. I think in that regard, I think the people in China are, in general, quite receptive about its governance.
It's like a company.
Right, exactly. It's well, there's actually people made a joke that when the party was founded in 1921, it was the biggest, the most successful startup company at that time. 15 people convened in Shanghai, and it brought them into such a great cause.
And now they are leading the whole nation. Yes. Yes. Rick, some say if you compare the Chinese system and, for example, the U.S. system, because of different culture and tradition, the Chinese side more collectivism, let's say, U.S. more based on individualism. So one scholar says, the Chinese system is more like a duet. You need cooperation and consultation, working together. The West, the U.S. in particular, is more like a duel. because everybody is fighting for your rights and interests, right, based on individualism. So that's why you have different system, and probably different system works for different countries. And is that easier to understand for the international society about China and the U.S.?
Well, I think culturally you're right about the cultural backgrounds, but politically, I don't think that it holds up the analogy completely, because you have a collection of people who are consulted in China, but the leadership is very central. I mean, it's not individualistic. In the U.S., you do have individuals, and you have people across the political spectrum, and you have two parties that may be having duels from time to time. But it's just a different system, and I think that we don't want to oversimplify, and I think their difference is both political and cultural, and they're not necessarily directly correlated with each form of government and each society's culture.
Mm-hmm. John, obviously, the Chinese system so far, it worked very well. If you look at this approval rate by the Chinese public, I think there's Ash Center of Howard University. There's 13 years long survey about these opinions. Basically, the approval rate remains above 90%, sometimes 95% of the central government. But still, China makes it very clear that China has no intention to export its ideology or its system to other countries, because the Chinese have already insisted, every country has its own, we call it national conditions. Countries are different from each other, so you have to find your own path of development. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, let me further add to what you just said. The support of the Communist Party in China right now is particularly strong, actually, among the younger people, the 200 million younger generation people. And this is actually quite remarkable. Thinking of the young generation that were brought up in relatively wealthy and better off environments, and they haven't been exposed to the kind of hardship. But I think this is a general consensus that people in China are quite happy, particularly after or during the pandemic. We can see that China has done a great job under the party's leadership. Now, in terms of your second question about China's not spreading this sort of a gospel, I would say, to the rest of the world, I think we'll be very cautious about exporting China's, the so-called China development model. I think, as a matter of fact, the government specifically said that even though we have this competition between China and the United States, but we're not going to compete on ideology. It's useless to compete on ideology, even though we don't mind sharing our experiences. Tell people how we actually did it. And but by the way, also caution people not to copy verbatim.
Right.
And as you said, every country is different, their own characteristics.
Being pragmatic. Yeah. Well, let's leave it there for now and then take a look at this week's Newsmaker. The current Chinese ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, announced his leave after 8 years of service in the statement released on the embassy's website on Monday. Let's find out more about the veteran Chinese diplomat. So, Rick, obviously, Cui Tiankai has been there in Washington for 8 years, a very challenging job, in particular at the later, period of the Trump administration, and then you have this pandemic, you have this, basically accusation, trade war, very challenging. But overall, what do people say about, the performance of Ambassador Cui?
I think it depends on which group of people you would be talking to. In the diplomatic community, he's quite popular. He's well respected because he is diplomatic, because he does his job of representing his government. As the policies have changed, he has changed with them. He doesn't cause any problems. He doesn't say things that are inflammatory, and he doesn't pick fights. He's not the wolf warrior diplomat that's very popular in today's China. So I think in the diplomatic community, he's respected, and people think that they can trust him. And he represents his government, which all diplomats respect. Now, in the press community, if you're going to talk about that, it's a mixed view. I mean, personally, he's respected, but he has not been very helpful to the press. He has not responded when there are a lot of questions, particularly about negative stories. So again, you could argue he's doing his job, right. but he's not that popular because he's doing his job.
Right. The media would love something dramatic, from the ambassador. I mean, that's understandable. So, John, how do you describe this diplomatic style of Ambassador Cui?
I think his diplomatic style is the classic example of a role model. I think I would hope that all the diplomats in China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs would follow him. And also have to add that actually, he is, we graduated from the same high school actually. So, I really admire what he has done for China. It's a great role model even for everyone. I think I also want to say that his popularity among the public here in China in general is actually very high. I think this is the right way to deal with foreign countries, and in difficult times, especially the relationship between the United States and China during Trump days. He played a tremendous role in handling the situation in the midst of the trade war. I still remember some of the answers he provided from the journalists. It was great examples of how to be a diplomat. So I don't necessarily agree that not making a journalist happy doesn't qualify as a good diplomat. I think he is. I wish him all the best. And
John, people would say, when you deal with, diplomats, quote unquote, like Pompeo, probably you need a wolf warrior. But, Ambassador Cui said, China-U.S. relationship is at a crossroad, and it's really between the choice between dialogue and conflict. Very briefly, like 10, 15 seconds, what do you make of that? Ambassador
Cui has done a dignified job, even in dealing with Mike Pompeo. There are a lot of accusations against China at the time. He handled these accusations quite calmly, but also quite effectively. So I think, at the end of the day, the job of a diplomat is for the national interest. It's not to satisfy somebody, to make somebody happy. And I think he does a tremendous job in terms of enhancing China's national interest.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests again. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo in one word. Thanks for watching. See you next week.